We are live. So thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Corrado. Did I say that right?
You did, yes.
Okay, great, excellent. So we met actually at one of your webinars recently about trauma, and I'm really excited to talk to you because it's a topic that I think is really prevalent in the arts in a way that people don't realize. And that's actually one of the things you said in your webinar was you should always treat someone as if they have had a trauma because most people probably have.
Right.
Yeah. So I'll give you a little introduction and then you can tell me whatever I missed. Tell us whatever I missed. You're a doctor of social work and licensed clinical social worker. And you use voices and storytelling to transform trauma into art. And your guiding principles, like on your website, are to create, voice, and honor, which I love. And for any artists watching that are familiar with my work, I always talk about finding your values, those 3 to 5 words that mean a lot, and that totally relates to your work. I see that as your through line, and it's beautiful. You also have created this trauma-informed intervention, as you call it, stories with a Z, which is on your shirt. Love it. Yes. Which is kind of informed your work with underserved and marginalized youth and service providers like clinicians and community leaders. And you also have a ton of resources on your website. So anybody watching, we'll put that in the comments and I'll make sure it's on our YouTube video. Your website, you've got videos and pamphlets to download. And you also do conferences and events and meetings that are to identify ways to create, voice, and honor stories through creative mediums. And you're also an artist. So you totally fit into the category of which I work. You work in mixed media mosaics, which I find fascinating. You're actually the only person I've met who works in that medium. And you've talked about like working with geodes lately, which I find fascinating.
Me too.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us an introduction, anything I missed, and anything you want to add.
Well, I feel like you did a really comprehensive job and highlighted multiple different things. But as you already mentioned, I'm a social worker. I have my doctorate, my master's, and my bachelor's all in social work. And I've been involved in a lot of different projects as a social worker. The focus of my work, the core focus of my work, is providing trauma-informed support to urban youth, particularly. I also work with people all across the lifespan, but that's my area of specialty. And I'm involved in a lot of different initiatives, connected with a lot of organizations, but the core of my work kind of goes back to providing support for youth who've experienced trauma. And I've done that in a lot of different settings as well. For many social workers, we have our hands in a lot of different things. Sometimes the systems that we're working in aren't necessarily stable. So it's comforting to know that if you don't have stability one place, you maybe can find some more stability somewhere else. So I've worked in a lot of different settings. And I'm a trauma survivor. In the course of me studying and understanding the academic side of trauma, I didn't even realize that I was also a survivor of complex trauma. I just didn't call it trauma. And then there was kind of this like parallel process that was happening where I was learning different strategies to support myself in overcoming my own traumas. And in the meantime, I was also supporting other people and I was also learning about it academically. So like my work kind of intersected at some point where I was kind of integrating what I knew to help myself navigate through trauma and then applying that to my clients and then also thinking about it from a theoretical clinical social worky lens. Yeah, and that's also kind of part of my artistic journey too, is the arts helped me to navigate through really difficult multi-layered traumas throughout my life. And I'm a proponent of like, before we implement an intervention or try it with someone else, it's really good for us to have practice with it as well. So I have delved into the arts myself. I've also like pursued pathways of trauma healing. The same way that I'm advocating for other people to do that, I'm also trying to do that for myself at the same time.
That's great because I always, so I coach artists in development and I'm writing a book about artist development. And one of the things that I'm always highlighting is authenticity in the work. And I always tell artists that they really need, when they're creating their brand, there has to be this authentic voice to it. And so it sounds like that's exactly what you're doing. So as far as the artist route goes, I think you're nailing it. And I know that's not even your primary focus. But I have a question for you about the clients that you work with. So I work with mostly artists who a lot of which I find have been through trauma. I'm curious, if you're starting with them from the trauma side, do you find a lot of self-identified artists, or do they discover that throughout the trauma work, which is what the purpose of stories is a little bit?
So I would say that some of my clients come to me knowing that they have like a particular affinity for an artistic medium, but a lot of my clients start off saying that they're not even creative, which I find to be amazing, especially because every client that I've ever worked with has demonstrated some type of creativity. So sometimes it takes like pulling that out of them. So I'll kind of help them highlight different things that I see as their creativity. If they start off saying, I'm not even a creative person, then, they might say something about how they were able to navigate a challenge at school, or how they were able to deal with a conflict. And I'll say things like, wow, that was really creative. I thought you weren't creative. And then, try and like draw that out of them. And then what I find is that everyone has some type of affinity for some type of art, even if they're not a creator of art. They may be an appreciator of art. And so once you find those things, they can really be a therapeutic ally when you're working with someone who's been through trauma.
Yeah, which is a great transition kind of into the next area I wanted to talk about, which is about using creativity to work through trauma. And I also want to mention that one of my clients who had gone through addiction, I mean, once an addict, always an addict, but once he got clean, he came to me and said, I don't think I'm an artist anymore. And I went, he thought he lost that from going through that, which I think is a result partly from the trauma in some ways. So I'm curious, since I'm not trained, and I've mentioned this to you before, I feel like so much of what I do is social work, and I probably should be trained in some of this. But I'm curious, and you said actually in that first webinar that I attended that it's not always safe to call out trauma to somebody. And that's one of the things that I've done unwittingly, I think is when I see artists that have been suffering from trauma, and I think it's obvious, so I say it, and a lot of times they don't realize they're suffering from trauma, and it's been really complicated. And so I'm curious about your process of using creativity to work through that trauma, which I think is in some ways a way around calling it out directly, right?
Yeah. So I'll speak to a couple things relating to like why it might not necessarily be the best thing to directly address trauma when you see it. A lot of people who have experienced trauma don't even call it trauma. So we have this whole field that's emerging. We have like all these different trauma-informed practices, and trauma-informed has become this huge buzzword. But a lot of people, and that also was the case for me, I wasn't using the word trauma to define my experiences. So having someone call it that when I didn't call it that felt kind of jarring, surprising, because oftentimes, even if we're navigating through really difficult experiences, we don't necessarily use that term to define it. And then another thing that's really important to know is that one of the main symptoms or the aftermath of trauma is avoidance. So a person has experienced a whole lot of pain, a whole lot of adversity, something that has changed their view of themselves, other people, the world around them. And it's really painful. And sometimes like when we see that there's like an area of pain, especially if we're like, really enthusiastic to provide support to trauma survivors, we're like, oh, I see the bruise. Now I'm going to press the bruise right now because I know that it's there. And I want you to know that it's there. When in reality, that person is probably avoiding even talking or thinking about that injured part of themselves. So when we just directly say like, hey, I see there's a bruise there, let me poke it, the person's response might be very anxious, or they might shut down, or they might show some different behaviors that they don't usually display because we're touching something that hurts. And I think it's really important for us to remember that a trauma-informed perspective doesn't necessarily mean that you're talking to people directly about the trauma that they've been through. It's saying, you know what, this person who's in front of me has probably experienced some type of trauma at some point in their life, and I have to be careful, and I have to meet this person where they are, and I have to support them in looking for their strengths. I actually teach clinicians this too, because some clinicians learn all these different skills, these different strategies, these fancy interventions with really long acronyms, and they're like, I need to do this in order to help this traumatized person heal. When in reality, you may need to implement those interventions, or you might just need to be a safe person for them. You might need to create a safe environment. You might need to like apologize when you're wrong and talk to them about ways that they can like repair other relationships that they're experiencing. So we think, oh, that trauma informed means we have to talk to people about trauma. No, it's kind of like being aware that there's a bruise, being aware that there's an injury, taking the steps to be sensitive and empathetic and provide safety. And sometimes for trained clinicians, that means, all right, we're going to talk about that part that hurts. We're going to spend a lot of focused time working on that part that hurts, but more, I don't want to say more often than not, but really depending on where that person is in their recovery and their healing process, they might not be ready. Or they might be ready and they're like, listen, I want to unearth all of these different things. Let's talk about it. Let's explore it.
Right, right. And so tell us a little bit more about the creative process that you use. What Stories is.
Sure. So Stories actually began when I first graduated from Briere College with my master's degree. So all of my papers, all my projects, the focus of my work had been providing support to people who've been through trauma, particularly youth. And I was learning as much as I could from the theory, from the literature, attending different trainings. And what I was finding was that um, although there was like really solid theoretical information, people didn't really help you connect the theory with the practice. And there was like not very much guidance about how to support people, like urban youth of color and navigating their trauma stories. So I started like kind of combining these different processes, and that's like where these things kind of like there was this parallel process of me learning different artistic mediums, me introducing them to my clients, me trying something to heal from my own trauma,
Cool.
and then implementing it with someone else. So I was doing this narrative process with my clients before it was even called anything. And I was like, okay, let's break your story into smaller parts. So instead of us just saying like, let's tell your story, let's have you write the names of different significant life events, positive and negative, on note cards. And doesn't matter what order they're in, we'll organize them later. So we started off writing different names for significant events on note cards, and then I helped them organize them in chronological sequence. And then at some point, I don't remember when, but at some point we added in um, a box to contain the narrative. And that's actually something I had done several times to process my own traumas. I had these different boxes of different artifacts that were representative of the positives and the negatives at that point in time in my life. And I put them all into this box, and I did this several times. So I'm like, okay, well, that worked for me. It helped me contain everything. So let's add in a box. So we're gonna have these cards that are part of your narrative. We're gonna put it in the box. We're gonna close it when we're not working on it. Then when we are working on it, we're gonna open it back again. So it's like this visual and in like literal and symbolic containment. So then I was helping them. I was like, okay, so let's go through these parts of your story a little bit at a time. And you can do it however you want to do it. We can do it through pictures, through illustrations, or you can talk and I'll type in your words exactly as you say them. And we can do your narrative that way. So the first few narratives involve some photography, involved them speaking while I type their words. And then another one of them involved somebody creating illustrations. So every time we met, we would talk about other things that were going on in their lives. And then we would also take out the box, open the box, work on a couple of the cards. They would detail that part of their narrative in whatever medium they had chosen. And then we would close the box again. So yeah, I was doing this process, and these were clients I think it's a shame that clients are spoken of this way, but unfortunately, this is the reality. There are some clients that people will say to you, good luck getting anything out of them,
Right.
or they've been through all types of treatment. Or, have you seen that person's charges? Have you seen their abuse background? Like, good luck. And these youth who I was told, like, good luck, I saw such incredible resilience and enthusiasm to tell their narrative. And we came out of this process with each of them with pages and pages and pages of their unique life narrative. And then they would end it with, what do they want for their future? So the idea was, the story did not end with the last event that they detailed. The story actually ends with the future and where you want to go from here. So I was doing this process with my clients, and I decided I wanted to get a doctorate. I didn't know why, except I wanted more people to listen to me as a younger woman of color. And I said, I want to have the same authority to be able to, speak to things that other people have. So got into the doctoral program at Penn, and I decided that I wanted to focus my dissertation work on formalizing this process that I had already been doing, and also digging into the literature to find the theoretical supports for what it was that I was doing, because I knew that it was there, but it was just about finding it and explaining it in a way so that other people could follow.
Yeah.
So that I came out of my doctoral work with 2 resources for therapists to support their clients in telling their trauma narratives using different artistic mediums, and also 10 video clips. So the idea is, like, some people don't necessarily want to look at a book, but video and communication through video is really important, like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
In society now. So I said, if somebody doesn't want to look at a book, they can press play on one of these video clips, and they can be introduced to each of the steps that they're going to go through in the storytelling process. So, and the idea is that it's a framework, it's a foundation for telling your narrative, but everybody infuses their own creative process into it. And even though I created it, it looks completely different depending on the child, the adult, and how they want to express their narrative. So, and then from there, like, things have expanded and grown. It's like the Matryoshka dolls, when you open it and then there's another one inside, and then you keep opening and you're like, all right. That's kind of how my career has been, where I started off by creating these couple of resources, and then things just continue to expand exponentially. So now there are training programs, there are resource materials. I just did my count last night, and I'm at about 4,500 people that I've trained.
4,500, you said?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations, that's incredible.
Thank you. I have to also, like, allow things to sink in, because I see 4,500 and I'm like, well, I need to get to 5,000. Well, when do we get to 6?
Yeah.
But thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I now have different things for different groups. So I have, like, resources and trainings for therapists, clinicians. I have things for what I call community leaders. So those are people that interface with trauma survivors, but don't necessarily have their degree as a helping professional. They could be teachers, grandparents, after school program leaders,
or coaches.
Right.
Like me, I need to download those materials. Yeah.
Yes. And then there's also some things that are specifically for trauma survivors. So the idea would be that there's, like, something for everyone. And I really focused on urban youth because they're a highly traumatized population. And there aren't many resources that are out there that they can look at and say, like, this is for me. Like, I can see myself in these illustrations, in these words, in these examples. So.
Absolutely. And your branding it definitely speaks, I think, to urban youth too, which is great. Even Stories with the Z, I love it. And that's, obviously I teach branding, so I think you're nailing the branding.
That's great.
Yeah. And also, what you talk about as far as the process of putting the stories into these pieces into a box kind of reminds me, just for context for people who aren't familiar with trauma, you mentioned in your webinar about how the traumatic experiences are chaotic, and it's not necessarily linear. Like, you don't remember it in a straight line. So I imagine that part of that helps you piece it together, because it's not clear. People don't realize that. It's like me, when I was thinking that I understood trauma, it's like, well, clearly something happens. Yeah. So I think that's really important.
Mm-hmm.
Stress.
And then the idea behind that too is, so trauma results in a lot of fragmentation.
Right.
Like the example that I give often is like, let's say you have a glass or vase and you drop it, it shatters into a million pieces. Even if you were able to find all of those pieces and put them back together again, that glass, that vase has elementally been changed.
Right.
And I think some trauma interventions don't expect the fragmentation. It's like they expect somebody to come to get help when they're in a state of wholeness, when that's not the reality. So
Right.
the idea is like, meet people where they are, meet them where the fragments are. We start off with that, and we slowly but surely come to a place of order, integration, so we can make sense of things. But we should expect that people who've been through trauma are experiencing internal chaos, are trying to grapple with what to do with all these bits and pieces, because that's the reality of where they are.
Yes, absolutely. I love that. So also you talked about in the webinar about various types of trauma. And actually you mentioned it earlier here too, about how there's so many types of trauma. So obviously we're not going to go into all of those, but I'm curious if there is a specific type of trauma, if there's a name for it that's specifically related to like exploitation. So one of my specialties is like the exploitation of artists, which things like, skin color, being discriminated against based on your skin color, which to give an example in the arts would be what happened to Lil Nas X, who tried to break into the country charts as a Black man. Gender, which we all know about the Weinstein scandal and Kesha scandal, and also financial discrimination, I think, which in music, there's these things called 360 deals. And even as a painter or whatever, there's commissions that sometimes these commission-based processes end up being exploited. So what kind of trauma category would exploitation / discrimination, I guess, fall under?
So I think the things that you mentioned could be categorized under a few different things. I think it's also helpful to know. So from my perspective, we allow people to define what trauma is for themselves. However, it also is helpful to know that there are like some differentiations between stress, crisis, and trauma. But then also, that being said, if somebody feels that one of these experiences is traumatic, I'm not going to argue with them because, because you're never going to get anywhere from trying to define someone's experiences for themselves.
Absolutely.
So I would say, like, from a theoretical, technical perspective, some of those things might come under stress, or some of them might come under a crisis. However, some of them might also come under the category of trauma. So there is identity-based trauma, trauma that comes from systemic oppression. And then there's also a type of trauma, and depending on the theorist that you're looking at, there are different lists of categories. So the ones that I tend to highlight are the categories that are proposed by Briere and Scott, and also by Christine Courtois. And one of the categories on their list is betrayal trauma, which is interesting. So that might also play into the experiences that some of the artists that you're speaking to have experienced. When you expect to be able to trust someone, you entrust something to someone that is really important to you, that is, and you also trusted that person, that place, that institution with your safety.
Right.
And then everything kind of backfires.
Yeah.
You're left in a place of exploitation that could come under betrayal trauma.
Yeah, that definitely sounds right, at least for the work that I've done. I will also put those names you mentioned that have the list of traumas. If there's a link for that somewhere online, I'll put that in the comments. So if people want to look up and kind of explore these different types of trauma, if they're trying to name it for themselves, I think that might be a nice resource. So let's see. The next thing I kind of wanted to talk about was the evolution of trauma and how it can be passed down from generation to generation. And this is kind of the concept of Stockholm syndrome, I think, but you also called it trauma bonding, which I think is kind of the same thing. So you'll have to tell me there. But specifically, what I'm interested in is how the arts, I would say, and this is what my book is about too, about how the arts have through the years slowly been being squeezed out of what is considered, essential to our culture and society, and that a representation of that is just funding to the arts. You know, it's always the first to go. And actually, I will acknowledge that a bunch of mayors just got together and sent a letter to the White House asking for emergency funding from the pandemic, specifically for arts and culture. And so I hope that passes. I definitely support that. But it does tend to be the first thing to go. And I think I mean, I don't know if this even falls under trauma, but I think it's resulted in trauma because what's happening is that our culture is getting starved for art, you know, or we're teaching our kids that it's not a stable, sustainable career, for better or worse.
And we're also teaching them that if you can't make any money off of it, then what's the point?
Yes, exactly.
That's a whole nother.
Agreed. Yeah, and that's what my book is about. A lot of. I think that's kind of a problem. But can you talk about? Does that fall under the category of what you call trauma bonding? And what exactly? Oh, okay.
So trauma bonding is speaking to what happens early on in life when you've experienced trauma and neglect at the hands of your caregivers, and you end up bonding to the same person that's traumatizing you.
Okay.
So that's a little bit different.
Okay.
But I would love to speak to the fact that the arts are constantly being cut.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have been able to survive quarantine or half of the stressors in my life had it not been for art.
Absolutely. Right. And this is what I mean. It's undervalued. It's just undervalued, you know, and people take it for granted.
Something that people always ask me too, going back to like the finances behind art. People ask me, oh, do you sell your art? You have to sell your stuff. And for me, like, art helps me to stay alive. Like, it helps me navigate the deepest things that I can't articulate with words, and to commodify it and to say it's not worth anything unless someone's paying for it feels like deeply, I don't even know if insulting is the word, but because people are meaning well, but I think we also have to see the value even beyond how much money it can make for us. Like, I can't imagine quarantine with no music, I mean, even the television shows that we watch, like Netflix, that's art.
Yeah, absolutely.
Resin that I've been, experimentally playing with all quarantine. Photography, yes, photography, music, all these graffiti, all of these different things. Yes, they can make some of us money. And then for others of us, they are these creative outlets that help us to keep going in the midst of so much adversity. And I can't imagine what society, what our culture would look like without the arts. And we blame people for not having healthy coping strategies and for navigating things in unhealthy ways, which who gets to define what is healthy and what isn't? That's a whole nother story. Those rules are impacted by power, privilege, and oppression. But we won't go too deep into that right now.
Okay, really.
We blame people for not having these healthy coping strategies, but then we want to take away some of the most fundamental coping strategies that people can have in the arts and creative expression. And we wonder, why are people making these decisions and those decisions? Well, what other choices did they have left?
Yeah. Well, yeah, and that's why I kind of tie it to trauma. And Phil, again, you know way more about it than I do. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels like for me, my own journey as an artist, if you will. And my background is actually in tech and producing, which I would argue is art, but that's controversial in and of itself. But to be constantly told by my, not necessarily my family, but by like family in general and the institutions, even school, that what I want to do is not, I need a fallback career. I need to find something else. It's felt like a fight to do, and I'm super passionate and driven, so I've not let it stop me, but it feels traumatized. I kind of, to a smaller degree, I suppose, but it's like fighting for the survival of my art. which
Mm-hmm.
granted is not my life. So, you know, I know it's not as bad, but for someone who's really passionate about what they do, to constantly be fighting with everyone around you about the value of it,
Mm-hmm.
especially when it's slightly undefined, like my art, I guess, you know, it just feels after a while a little traumatizing.
Yeah, it's exhausting and it's really
Yeah.
draining. And it's funny because we say that the arts aren't essential, yet the arts are a part of every single part of our everyday lives. Like the cars that we drive, like represent innovation and creativity. The technology that we use every day. So we're saying that this is not that important. That funding should go to other things, but yet we're using it every day. And the arts make our lives so much more fulfilling. They give us like these conduits for expression, things that we can't always express in words. Just the possibilities with the arts are really endless. And we're using it, but we're saying, oh, well, good luck getting a career. We're using it, and like there's all these mixed messages that go along with this.
Exactly. And it also reminds me of you discussed briefly kind of like the neurology of like just how the limbic system, which represents like the survival mode, you know, and when somebody is in survival mode, which a lot of artists are in survival mode, you know, for an extended period of time, that the other parts of the brain are not full as up to full capacity, something to that extent, right?
You got it.
Yeah. So I think that's what I see a lot is that, you know, there's so much hustle to get the next dollar, to get the next whatever, because they don't necessarily want a day job, which means compromising themselves and their art, you know, so I think that's a problem there. And so tell us a little bit about your art, which I definitely don't want to skip over, about your work with mosaics and even geodes, because last night, or a couple nights ago maybe, I watched another webinar, which was about creation and destruction and the power of art, and even as a metaphor, what that means. And it was so beautiful and so healing in so many ways to just see how you used art. And I've never thought of mosaics in that way. So tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I have different things that kind of motivate my artistic process. I don't care about perfection when I'm creating things. I'm like, you know what? Every other area of my life, I have to do things perfectly. So in my art, I'm giving myself permission to make a mess. I'm giving myself permission to make mistakes and to creatively explore materials. Sometimes I love what I made. Sometimes I hate it. Sometimes I break it apart. Sometimes I put it on the wall. And I love playing with alcohol inks. They're these really cool. I get so excited to talk about alcohol inks. They're these really cool drippy alcohol-based inks, and you have to use them on a non-porous surface, or if it's a porous surface, you have to coat it in gesso. My little sister, who's 12, is like, "You can't ink everything, Megan," and I'm like, "I can if it's coated in gesso." Um,
Gesso? What's gesso?
Yeah, gesso is like a primer. So you know, like when you're painting the wall, you put a primer.
Yeah, but you paint it. Okay.
Yeah, so it's like that, but for artistic surfaces that you're going to use for your artwork.
Cool. Okay, so all you need
like,
is gesso.
Yeah, I'm like, can I ink that? It's porous. I can't ink it, but there's gesso, so I can ink it.
Cool.
So I love playing with the inks. I actually found it's funny because I actually participated in my own art therapy for years.
Right.
And I was so averse to like materials that were out of control to start off. Like my art therapist had me doing wet on wet watercolors because we were trying to work on like, how can I embrace messiness? How can I embrace things not going according to plan? And I just got so angry about it like the first few times. And she's like, tell me how you're feeling about like how the paint is going everywhere except where you want it to go. And I'm like, it's making me feel really irritated. Like I want to crumble this up. And she'd be like, no, we're going to sit with it. And then we would come back to it.
Cool.
And it would dry. And we started off like with these little circle sheets of paper. I had not learned how to tolerate that messiness and that kind of out of control quality in some artistic mediums that I would have never been able to tolerate alcohol ink. So I thank her. Her name was Anne. I thank my art therapist for that. So the alcohol inks are drippy. Depending on the surface that you're using, they do what they want. They're really vibrant and interesting. They like blend together with each other. So I have spent years playing around with the alcohol ink, seeing what it does, seeing what it can't do. I always feel like I don't have enough ink, even though if I showed you my my inks right now, you'd be like, really? Um, and then I also incorporate glass. So I usually actually work in layers. So I usually start off with a layer of alcohol ink on the surface. And then sometimes I'll use paper too. And because my main expressive mediums are writing and mixed media mosaics with the alcohol ink. It's like a mixed media alcohol ink collage glass stuff.
Cool.
And
Super cool.
yeah, told you I get really excited about this.
Yeah, well, and most people don't know about this kind of art, I feel like.
It's so fun.
Yeah.
Well, it's only fun if you embrace the fact that you can't control it.
Right.
If you start off trying to control it, good luck. You're going to be really aggravated and you're going to rip it to shreds. But like I'll do layers, so I'll like take pieces of paper. Some of them are like pages from my dissertation drafts or like something that I wrote, and then I'll paint them. Sometimes I'll write additional words on top about how I'm feeling, break them apart, collage them onto the surface, and then oftentimes my last layer is a layer of glass, and I use tempered glass a lot, which is also called crash glass or safety glass. It's what's in the side of your car windows. They don't actually break into shards; they just crumble.
Right.
So
it's not as harmful, basically. Well, it can't hurt you as much.
I mean, it can still hurt you if you squeeze it, but yeah, it doesn't break into shards, so it ideally is less dangerous. However, it still can cut you.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I put that layer on top. But before I can use that glass, so I buy it in these sheets from Amazon, and I break it with a hammer.
Nice.
I know, it's really therapeutic.
Yeah.
Like, yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then when you break it with the hammer, like it breaks off in like these little chunks. So when you glue it down, you can kind of see the essence of what's underneath it, but you can't. It's like a little distorted. Yeah. So I have been making. I don't know how long I've been making art. I was making art as a kid. I was writing a lot more when I was a kid, but I was always doing creative things. And I found art as a way for me to cope with trauma. If I did not have art, I don't know that I would be here speaking to you now. Art has helped me through some of the most difficult, traumatizing, overwhelming my life. It's helped me to find a place of peace and calm when there was just turmoil and chaos around me.
Yeah.
And some of the things I love and some of the things I don't love. I was saying in the webinar how I've been experimenting with resin. It's so messy.
Yeah.
It's disgusting. It's sticky. Gets all over everything. But during quarantine, I had resin, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to work with what I have. So I saw this person that was posting pictures of resin geodes on their, I think it was a YouTube channel. I was like, this is really cool. I'm going to try it. So I spent, I guess, months trying to perfect my own version of what a resin geode would look like. It was messy. It was gross.
But it's so beautiful. So geodes, for people who don't know, are basically like these rocks that you break open and there's all these crystals and things inside, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And the rock, before you break it, it just looks like an ugly rock. Like you
right,
wouldn't think that there was something that beautiful inside.
Yeah, well, and that's again, like all of this stuff you're talking about here. This is the only picture I could find, but I felt like we had to show something about what you're talking about. This is more of the mosaic kind of stuff you're talking about.
Yeah.
It's beautiful acts of creation, and there's just as a metaphor for life. You know, as you're talking about all of it, it's just like even about the fact that you can create on any surface. Is just so therapeutic and all of that. I wish I had more pictures, but yeah, cool.
My next goal, I want to combine the resin geodes with mosaic, but I just had to wait. Like it's like when I learned a new medium, I want to play around with it. I want to see what the boundaries of it are, what I can do, what I can't do, what frustrates me, what excites me. And I'm like reflecting on the whole process. And then I kind of, once I've mastered a certain thing that I want to master, then I like figure out how I can push another boundary. So I
Right.
haven't quite pushed the boundaries of the resin geodes yet. But when I do and when I'm ready, I'm going to combine that with the alcohol ink mixed media mosaic. So that's the next step.
Cool. I can't wait to see it. That sounds awesome. And I think part of the reason why the actual artwork itself is so powerful is because it's coming from this. It's so therapeutic for you. You know, I mean, even the way you light up, the way you talk about it, clearly, this is like such an important part of your process. You know, so I love it. Thank you for sharing it with us. You know,
Sure.
The last thing I kind of want to touch on and kind of wrap up with is speaking of healing and moving through trauma, the fact that the Black Lives Matter movement is still very much active and going on, which I think is necessary and important. And one of the things I think there's an opportunity to build here. It feels like there's a lot of stuff coming up on the walls. You know, I know it's not new for people of color, but it's certainly new for a lot of white people, and it's been buried for better or worse. You know, and so there's a lot of stuff coming out right now, and there's an opportunity to rebuild right now, which I think is really exciting. And I'll kind of believe that artists tend to lead the way in things like that. I hope artists are leading the way with that. Again, for all the way you talk about your artistic process, I think as a metaphor is where it's kind of a good direction that I think we need to go hopefully we go with the Black Lives Matter movement. And one of the things you said in your webinar was that when you're working with trauma patients, it's about acknowledging the wrongdoings and then working together with your client to find another way. And I don't remember if you used exactly the words another way, but you might have, and that's definitely my hashtag, another way, which also applies to where we are at right now in our culture. So do you, especially being a woman of color, do you want to speak to any of that and any kind of parallels you see with your work?
So as you were talking, I was thinking about what you mentioned, saying that this is nothing new for people of color, but it does seem to be new for other individuals in our culture right now.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it's disheartening that this is new, because there have been people who have been oppressed in this nation for as long as we can remember. And to know that for some people this is new, it's like, oh wow, it feels invalidating of all of the experiences that have been happening for centuries.
Mm.
I also think about the role that the arts unfortunately have played in furthering oppression.
Yes.
And I'm thinking of a friend of mine, a colleague. She has a collection of Black art throughout a really long period of time. And she showed me some of the pieces. And it's actually a collection from her mom. And her mom wanted to gather all the different ways. She wanted to gather different pieces throughout the history of African Americans in this country to depict, to show how they have been depicted societally. And
Cool.
then part of this collection also highlights, like, okay, this is how American culture has depicted us, but this is who we actually are. She showed me some of the pieces that she had, and they emphasized stereotypes of Black men and Black women, and had all types of racial slurs, and these were in people's homes for centuries, and nobody thought twice about them. She has clay sculptures and posters, and even the artwork on a bottle of toothpaste.
Right. There's a museum, actually, I think, of things like that. I don't know the name of the museum, but there might even be more than one. Yeah.
The African American Museum in DC also has a lot of these different artifacts. So I'm looking at these things in in her home, and thinking about how the arts have been used as propaganda to dehumanize African Americans in this society, and many people didn't even notice that it was happening.
Right.
Like these things are like, it's your toothpaste bottle. Like
Right.
it's the thing that, it's the jar that you put your cookies in. That's a piece of pottery, a sculpture. And I think that if the arts have the power to promote prejudice and racism and hatred and injustice, I think the arts can also do the opposite too.
Yes.
But I think we have to be intentional about doing that. So I believe that those images were intentionally incorporated in art throughout our nation's history on purpose to dehumanize the African American community. But I also believe that we can use the arts to uplift and empower the African American community, and also to show other images, other perspectives that are empowering and show a more accurate and that depict African Americans in a more accurate light. So I think the arts have, and we look at that, like if we look at this throughout different cultural contexts, the arts have been used as propaganda.
Yeah. Birth of a Nation was hailed as like a brilliant film.
So if we can use the arts as propaganda, right, to promote negative changes and stereotypes, we can also do that to promote healing, growth, connection, and recovery.
Absolutely. And let that be a call to action for all the artists watching, to actively do that and promote, and not just promote Black artists, but also create yourself. I think that one of the great exciting things for me about this movement is that it is really multicolored. Finally, for the first time, again, long overdue, but at least we're here now. And so let's use this as an opportunity to, like I said, rebuild. I think it's a great thing that they're pulling down the statues. Let's build new ones. Let's create new ones. So really well put. Thank you for sharing that. Those thoughts.
I think too. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go for it.
So my webinar a few days ago was about creativity and destruction, and I'm not going to say that I'm not going to take a political stance in my comments, but I'm just going to say what I know.
Okay.
And what I know is that creativity, in order to create many things, whether it be pottery or mosaics or paint or sculptures, or dance or a play or a poem, a written work of art, all those things require us to let go of what was and allow space for some type of destruction so that something can be rebuilt. So once again, that's not a political statement. I'm just saying that when I look at the arts and when I look at change and movement and growth, I see the need for creativity and destruction to be able to coexist in the same space. Because without that, we're either stuck. I mean, I don't think we can stay in the same, either of the same spaces. Like we can't, staying stagnant is problematic, and staying in a constant state of destruction can be traumatizing.
Yes.
However, I think we all collectively need to really engage in reflection about the role of creativity and destruction, period, in our world.
I love that, and I 100% agree. And in fact, in my book, I kind of used the template of Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he talks about the need. Joseph Campbell talks about the need to how in every creation story since the beginning of time, across cultures, there's always some version of people, or whatever the evolution is, killing their creators, and how important it is for that death and destruction of that. And one of the things he says, a quote that I love, is that he says they need to die not because they are keepers of the past, but because they are keepers. Period. And I think that's so spot on, because this is the idea of evolution. We need to be in a constant flux. We're constantly growing, we're constantly creating, and we're constantly destroying. And that is part of the creative process, as you so beautifully put, especially in mosaics. You have to destroy in order to create it. So yeah, Absolutely, I 100% agree. Thank you again so much for this conversation, because I think it's a really important conversation for the arts, for us to start talking about this stuff and to acknowledge it. I hope if there's any questions, now's the time for people to type it in, but this will be posted on YouTube. My YouTube channel is at TSGO Prods, Prods. And you can follow Stories with a Z. What's your social handle?
Stories Guide.
Stories Guide, and that's your website and all of your social. So please support Dr. Corrado. And do you don't sell any of your art, or how can people support you?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't sell my art. I just make it.
Awesome. I think that's incredibly inspiring. But also, just because the coach in me wants to tell you that it is okay to sell your art if you want to sell your art, and it's empowering if you want
I don't want to.
But yeah, and that's fair. And that's fair. And again, also it's part of your healing process for sure. So I think in some ways there might be a disconnect for you to start selling it. So I respect that 100%. But it's no doubt valuable. And
I share it. I show it.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's excellent. So please check it out, because I also find it inspirational. Any final words before we go?
No, thank you for having me. I feel like this was a great conversation and we talked about a lot of different things.
Agreed. I know. I love it. We went everywhere. So thanks again. And just remember, there's always another way. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.